Hello and welcome to this video lecture for Introduction to Philosophy. And today we're going to look at the text African Ethics and Partiality by Molefe. And this is a text we're looking at as part of our Ethics Around the World series, our module for this week. And we're going to talk about the idea of partiality and impartiality and their kind of ethical significance, as this is really the major thing that comes up from Molefe's article, the idea of impartiality, and especially the kind of criticism we get of impartiality, where Molefe's going to argue that the idea of partiality, of showing partiality towards people you care about, actually builds an ethical perspective that makes more sense in an African context. So we're going to look at that argument today. So what is impartiality? So we think of being impartial, we think of people like judges, police officers, referees, people that have the job of not taking sides, of allowing the interests of all to sort of count equally. So a referee is not biased towards one side or the other, but has to be completely neutral and impartial between the parties, so it doesn't give the interests of any one more weight than the other. And of course, that should be the attitude of police officers, judges, and other people that we think of as importantly being impartial. Perhaps teachers as well don't, for a teacher to kind of count some people more worthy than others, or to grade them differently than others, that's not being impartial. So everybody's sort of subject to the same criteria, and you judge everybody impartially, judge everybody the same according to the criteria. So that's the idea of impartiality. The interests of all should count, and they should count equally. We don't discriminate between people. Philosopher Peter Singer talks about the standpoint of the art of the impartial spectator. So in ethics, taking the standpoint where we can be impartial between different interests and not take sides is really important. So the impartial spectator idea is that morality requires us to abstract from our self-interest and our personal point of view. And it means being moral or being ethical means adopting a point of view where the interests of all count equally. So there's no basis to discriminate among people, since the interests of all should be given equal concern, according to the idea of impartiality. Now, we can also ask, why is impartiality important? Or why might we think that it's an important value? When we think about this, I think there are three main sort of principles that undergird the idea of impartiality. Three reasons for which we consider it to be morally important. And those reasons are fairness, treating people fairly, being fair, equal treatment, treating people equally, the same concern, and universal concern, in other words, treating everybody the same way. So it's not just some people, but everybody is subject to the same fairness and equal treatment. As Molefe said, the aim of morality is to expand the scope of our sympathies, to reach out to humanity as a whole as far as possible. Is often thought to be a sort of key aim of morality, to get beyond our bias and to get beyond our self-interest. And that's why we think impartiality is important, because it provides a perspective where we can rule out that kind of bias and the self-interest that would lead us to favor our friends, colleagues, or whoever, instead of making a more sort of universal and impartial decision. So we're not supposed, morally speaking, we're not supposed to count ourselves or our friends more important than others. According to impartiality, our moral concern is expanded through impartiality to reach everybody, and so we're able to reach everybody equally. So that's the idea of impartiality. We treat everybody fairly, equally, and everybody is treated the same. Now let's think for a minute about the idea of partiality, which of course is the opposite of impartiality. So we can start with the observation, I think, that relationships of friendship, relationships of love, seem to call for the very opposite of an impartial perspective. So some such relationships unquestionably rank among the greatest goods of life. In other words, we rate relations of friendship, relations of love to be among the most important things in our lives. So it seems like we could say a conception of morality that is in tension with the maintenance and promotion of these good things is unacceptable. So this is a quote from Molefe, who is taking the position of partiality and saying that partiality is required by relationships like friendship and love. These relationships are super important in our lives, so we have to make sure our notion of morality is not in tension with them, that it doesn't ask us to sacrifice these relationships. Kind of relationships of partiality are when you have a special duty to a particular person. So instead of, whereas a referee is impartial, for example, a coach is supposed to be partial to his or her own players, looking after their good. A father, a parent is obviously partial towards their offspring, towards their children in comparison with other people's. A therapist is partial towards their clients and the needs of their clients. So we find areas where we value partiality, where we value the idea of special relationships with people. And Molefe points out that we are morally propelled to do more for our special relationships than we do for relationships with strangers. And there is a theory that we can do more good by focusing on these special relationships than by trying to be impartial. If we try to be impartial and please everybody, well, we don't really know how to do that, and we're not very good at that, but we seem to be good at sort of being partial and promoting the good of particular people in our lives, our children, our friends, and so on. And maybe if we sort of if everybody focuses on that, the world will be a better place. So there's an argument coming here for partiality as a moral value as well, in addition to, or maybe in conflict with impartiality here. And so there seems to be a dispute here about whether impartiality or partiality is the best moral value. Now, one way we can defend the idea of partiality, and as I said, this is in fact what Molefe wants to do, to make the case that there's a moral case for partiality, and he mentions some aspects of the African context that we'll talk about a little later. So it's our special relationships with our own projects, in other words, things we care about, our friends, our families, and our colleagues, that are essential to who we are. Now, if impartiality asks that we sacrifice those relationships, then perhaps it's too demanding and perhaps psychologically impossible. So this is the argument that partiality makes against the idea of impartiality. If we focus on our own projects, our own interests, our own friends, families, colleagues, then we're perfectly capable of doing that, because those are the things that we care about. Sometimes with impartiality, we're going to be asked to sacrifice those things for the greater good. And the question here is whether impartiality is asking us something that's perhaps too demanding in terms of giving up things that we care about. And this is illustrated by the famous trolley problem in ethics. So the basic setup of the trolley problem goes like this, right? The trolley is traveling fast on this track, and as we can see, there are 5 people tied to the track who are going to be killed when the trolley rolls over them. Now you have the opportunity, by pulling that lever, you have the opportunity to change the direction of the trolley so that it goes on the other track. Now if it goes on the other track, that's going to lead to just one person being killed instead of 5. So if we look at this in terms of impartiality, we have to say, well, perhaps it would be best to make the least sacrifice, right? So we want to sacrifice the least people. One person dying is better than 5. So impartially, the right thing to do is to redirect the trolley to run over the one person so that we can save the 5. That's the morally maximal outcome. Now, the problem with this is that the morally maximal outcome, according to the impartial view, requires us to pull that switch. In other words, it requires us to make ourselves responsible for the killing of the one person tied to the other track. Now, some people might say, well, that's just squeamishness, right? If we can save 5 people, we're required to do that, to pull the lever. But once we pull the lever, we're involved. We're involved in the situation, and we've made ourselves part of the situation. So as an impartial person, sometimes you're going to find yourself in these situations where you have to ignore your own projects, your own interests, and to do something which requires you to sacrifice for the greater good. You may have a deep disgust of killing. However, in these kind of situations, you're going to be asked to sacrifice for the greater good and to actually kill somebody in order to save a greater number of people. What about if the one person who is tied up is your friend? Again, from the standpoint of partiality, from the standpoint of what you care about, that's really important. You don't want to redirect the trolley so it kills and runs over your friend. But from the impartial perspective, that seems to be irrelevant. All that matters here is that 5 people are saved and 1 person is killed. And that's the maximal moral outcome, right? Because 1 person is less than 5. So it's irrelevant from that point of view that the person is your friend or is somehow related to you. That fact doesn't matter. But of course it matters to us, and it matters to our own projects, our own interests, and who we are. Those things matter. So if we follow an impartial perspective, we might find ourselves often in situations where we're asked to do something to sacrifice things that we care about, our own projects, things that are important to us, people we care about perhaps, in order to satisfy the demands of impartiality. And there's a question about whether that demands too much of us psychologically, whether the sacrifice it demands is just not viable with being a human being with interests and concerns and everything else. Another way to bring out this dilemma is with the crying baby problem. So the crying baby problem goes like this. Enemy soldiers have taken over your village. They have orders to kill all remaining civilians. You and some of your townspeople have sought refuge in the cellar of a large house. Outside you hear the voices of soldiers who have come to search the house for valuables. At this point, your baby begins to cry loudly. You cover his mouth to block the sound. If you remove your hand from his mouth, his crying will summon the attention of the soldiers who will kill you, your child, and the others hiding out in the cellar. To save yourself and the others, you must smother the child to death. Is it appropriate for you to smother your child in order to save yourself and the other townspeople? Now, if you look at the structure of this example, it's similar to the trolley example we just looked at, in that what you're asked to do is to make a sacrifice of one person in order to save a greater number of people. Here, what you have to do is more immediate. It's not just flipping a switch. You actually have to smother your child to death. But it brings out the starkness of that contrast, that sometimes doing something to save the larger number of people, something that perhaps impartiality would demand of us, requires that we do something almost inconceivable and unconscionable to somebody we love and to somebody we care about. So that brings out very starkly, I think, the contrast between impartiality and how it contrasts and how it seems to conflict with our commitment to partiality. Of course, there's no right answer here, and there's no sort of, in these situations, it's hard to think that you have time to think about the situation. But it just brings out the contrast between an impartial perspective when what matters is how many are saved, and the partial perspective when what matters is you and your relation to your child that you love and care about. So Molefe tells us that on page 7, if morality is defined in terms of impartiality, morality will consume all of one's life. One will have no life that they can call their own in an interesting way. Rather, one will be a slave of morality. So the idea here comes from the examples we've looked at, that morality, if we conceive of it as in impartial terms, as an impartial value, is going to demand that we sacrifice things we care about for the greater good whenever that calculation works out a certain way. So it could be things that we care about at an instant because there's now the balance is on the other side, and more people can be saved or more happiness can be created by sacrificing something we care about. We have to sacrifice that thing. So this is the charge that morality as impartiality is too demanding. It prevents us from developing relations to things that we care about, since those things can be sacrificed in an instant. There may be cases where we want to say it's right to sacrifice those things. There may be cases where we say it's just inconceivable that we could make that sacrifice and still go on and think of ourselves as being the same person. So that's really what the issue is about here. Now, so Molefe tells us about 3 factors that recommend partiality in the context of sub-Saharan African culture. And the 3 that he talks about are family, ancestor veneration, and the normative concept of personhood. So the idea of the family is that you must prioritize kindness in the family before expanding it to the wider society. That's in fact where we learn the idea of kindness, what it means, how to apply it to people. It's almost like we master it there and then you apply it to the wider society. So our duties weaken somewhat the further out from the circle they go. So the immediate circle is our family, our kin, and those are the people that we have the most kind of duties to, where we have to prioritize kindness. And the duties weaken as we sort of go out in that circle towards non-family members, community members, and the wider world, and so on. So there's an idea here, again, I think the ethical idea that we can do the most good by caring for people we are close to. So in the family, we learn to sort of prioritize kindness and learn to care about people in this very sort of close unit. And then we have sort of weaker duties towards people further out. So for Molefe, that's an aspect of African culture, the priority of the family, that recommends the idea of partiality. We start with what we consider to be greater obligations towards the family and people that are immediately close to us. Now, ancestor veneration takes place in family bloodlines. So each family will have its own ancestors and focus on those. And that again suggests partiality, that each family is sort of focusing on itself and venerating its own ancestors. In terms of the idea of personhood, Molefe suggests that in the African context, there's this idea of self-perfection, that one has a duty to perfect oneself and to discharge your duties for the good of the whole. So personhood in this sense is something you achieve As we'll see, there's a difference here from some other ethical views. But for Molefe, in the African context, we become full persons through what we do and how we behave. So our moral identity develops. Our moral identity is dependent on our history and our relations. So it's not based on impartiality, but it's based on becoming a concrete example of a good person. We achieve the concept of personhood through developing ourselves. We become a good person of a certain kind through developing ourselves. And that's what's important, how we sort of develop ourselves into personhood. So the journey to moral perfection for Molefe is a personal project. It's something we take up and something we carry with us through our lives, involving duties to self and family in the first instance, and ultimately expanding out to the wider group as well. Okay, so we've been looking at the debate in Molefe's article between impartiality and partiality. And the value of these two different things. As we saw, impartiality brings values of fairness and equal treatment, whereas partiality embodies this idea of care towards those we love, care towards those we're close to, which we also consider to be an important value and perhaps an important moral value. So we've seen their role in ethics, how they sort of encompass different roles, play different parts. And we've looked at Molefe's argument and his defense of partiality in African ethics, his claim that in the sub-Saharan African context, it's partiality that matters most. This idea of becoming a concrete good person through what you do, through your duties towards family and kin and the community, and you sort of become the sort of concrete embodiment of a good person. Right? That's what ethics is about. It's not about applying sort of impartial rules that treat everybody equally, but becoming a good person. So that's something that we can see in Molefe's article. That's a sort of idea that's quite close to conceptions of virtue ethics that were sort of ancient theories, but also have been sort of rediscovered in contemporary times. So we'll see some parallels there as well.